Our next presentation has two presenters. Both are members of the ASCLD board. Linda Jackson, the Director of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, and Bruce Houlihan, the Director of the Orange County Crime Laboratory. Both directors have extensive forensic management experience and are extremely active in the forensic community. Linda and Bruce are here to give an update on the Emerging Drugs Task Force, which they have been pushing forward together all year, so information and resources can be provided to you, so we can aid in combating the emerging drug issues that we know that are really destroying our communities. Please welcome Linda Jackson and Bruce Houlihan.
Thank you, Scott, and good morning. I'm not going to read the slides to you. I think you can do that. Most of the materials that I'm going to be talking about are in EventMobi. They're also on the ASCLD board's website, especially because some of the links are long and you can click on them to get more information. But I do want to make a few comments, if I can, about some of the activities that the Emerging Drugs Task Force and our Opioids Task Force have been working on through this last year. But before I do that, this is not on your slides. The board published a paper on helium shortage in the United States. I'm just kind of curious how many of you have actually read that document? Wow. Okay, how many of you actually are experiencing a helium shortage at some point this last year? Okay. So for us in Orange County, it's a little bit of a crisis. So we have supply, we have demand, but it seems generally speaking that curve is kind of trending downward. And so when we don't have helium, we don't have any helium at all. That's what's been a little scary for us. So we've had marginal success in our toxicology converting, seized drugs, a little bit more success. But if you have any questions about that peripherally, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. And there are other people in the group that have actually been working on this too. So there's really a supply issue internationally as it's coming to the United States, but that may have impact given how much helium we use in a lot of our instrumentation. So I'm a big fan of NIFLS, and for very little investment on our part, we get a lot of bang for our buck, I think, in terms of reports and information that I can use, not just in my crime laboratory, but nationally, and especially with my bosses and with our stakeholders and clients and law enforcement. So I'm not going to steal Demia Presley's thunder a little bit by talking about this too much, but I heard this week that we have a 98% participation rate in seized drugs and NIFLS, which is fantastic across the national crime labs. But they're now moving into the toxicology and the ME coroner space. And so really I'm here to encourage you to participate in this. We just started at our lab in both of these. The ME coroner piece to this is really coming, I think, but they're really focusing on toxicology right now. So the process is very similar to what we've been doing with seized drugs. It's just really antemortem and postmortem toxicology, and then trying to get the medical examiners and coroners participating as well. So the postmortem toxicology, of course, is difficult because sometimes the medical examiners and coroners are a little bit more separate from crime laboratories, and those of us that actually do both, it can be helpful to NIFLS, but I would encourage you to actually participate in this as you can, because this is really one of the more concrete things that we are doing right now in this space and trying to gather information, which is what the group is really trying to do for you. ODMAP is a program through HIDA that actually tries to generate real-time information about overdoses nationally. So there are mobile apps that the coroners and field responders, or the field investigators, I should say, can actually use to say, we think there's an overdose here in this geographic area. They have facilities providing this through websites. Hospitals can actually enter the information. We do this a little bit more downstream. In a couple weeks after an incident, we actually try to provide as much information as we can. But I think the goal with this project is to provide as much real-time information about what's going on across the country as much as possible. So if you have a medical examiner or a coroner relationship, this is a really good project for you to actually help with. The Stone Monthly Calls, this is by invitation only. I just want to mention it to you that are in law enforcement. This is a goal of connecting interdiction teams directly with crime laboratories that are local to the interdiction team. So the calls are monthly to talk about these issues, but the network actually helps facilitate the interdiction teams. If they have specific questions on the drugs or what they're actually working on, they can call the crime lab chemists directly. So if you're interested in this, come see me and I can actually hook you up with the individuals who are running these calls in this network. When we started working with BJA and COAP on some of the grants, and I was listening to what was provided, it was very encouraging to me how much money is actually available. And more than that, I think BJA was encouraging us to apply, as they typically do, but the amount of money that actually is available to you is an opportunity that we really need to take advantage of. And particularly if you're not into LC triple quad space, or if you're not doing QTOFs yet in toxicology, this is your opportunity. I would strongly suggest that now is the time to do this. Those pieces of equipment are very, very expensive, but they can save you a lot of downstream long-term costs, and BGA will actually help fund this. And there are a number of different grants that they're actually putting out almost weekly. I think I saw 2 in the last couple of weeks. So again, I would encourage you to look at the links because they're more than willing to work with us, and they're very interested in working with crime laboratories in this. We also had a number of conversations with the CDC over the last couple months, or a few months, I should say. If you ever have a chance to meet Paula Braun, who works with the CDC, she's been working with us, and especially Matthew Gamet, on some of their projects. They're very, very interested in what we're doing. They're a little bit more in the post-mortem space right now, but they're getting very interested in driving toxicology. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. I'm sorry, I'll talk about OD2A here first. ESOS and OD2A, or Overdose to Action, is really the project that's actually funding the mortality and morbidity data collection by the CDC. But as they are generating an interest in moving to antemortem toxicology and driving toxicology in this program, which we've been talking about, we can actually help them with the postmortem work, but also with the antemortem work. But the CDC is also funding fentanyl standards, free for us. So I would encourage you, if you haven't done this, to get these standard sets. They're traceable, pure samples. I think our shipment, we had something in the order of 40 different vials of different types of fentanyls for us. They're underwriting this through Cayman and Cerulean. You're more than welcome, if you have a DEA license, to actually ask for these standards from them as well. NDUS is really a email communication network, very real time. I get emails almost every day. Most of their conversations recently have been about particular synthetic opiates and fentanyls also. But it's pretty wide array topics and kind of a list server or a news server type of context. Very real time. It's really good for your clan lab chemists and your drug chemists to get involved as well. Really opening discussions about things that are seen for the first time, or people may have covered an issue that you haven't yet. If there's one topic I've heard the most this week is Paul Speaker's papers, and so I'm not going to belabor that point. In fact, I would recommend, if you're going to be speaking at ASCLD, make sure your papers are on Tuesday, because by the time you get to Thursday, everybody's talked about your stuff, and they've stolen your thunder, right? So Paul's papers, which I'm a strong supporter of, have been talked about quite a bit. But one of the things I want to point out about his opioid paper when I was discussing with him is when he's talking about the economic impact of the opioid crisis, he's actually talking about not just in toxicology or postmortem toxicology, he's talking about the impact on your entire laboratory, even areas that are not directly related to the opioid crisis. And so it's the impact for everything we're doing simply because of the opioid crisis. So I'm looking forward to when this actually gets published. Because the last thing I want to say is really what our goal is for the next year. I've also heard the metaphor of herding cats, like I'm sure you have this week, but I do think, not to torture the metaphor, we do know where the cats are, or who the cats are a little bit. In our fortunate ability to participate in these dialogues, we actually been able to meet with a lot of different groups and see what they're doing in this space. So for example, AAFS has an opioid group. I mentioned most of the other groups on here. I forgot name is on this, and we haven't developed enough conversations with them, but we want to work with medical examiners and coroners a lot more. But what we're really trying to do and be a part of is synthesize this information into really solid, usable information that you can query, that you can generate stats on, that you can see trends on. And there's just so much information going on in this area right now that this is one of our challenges. So in July, one of the things Jonathan McGrath is actually doing in DC with this symposium is actually talking about how do we unify and collect a lot of this data into a format that the crime laboratories can use. So get involved, and if you have any questions about what we're doing on this committee, I'll be happy to talk to you. There's a lot of good stuff going on. So, Linda.
Thank you. All right, to transition to the bane of my existence right now, industrial hemp. For those of you that came to the Bring Your Own slides yesterday, we had a active conversation about this during that when Jeremy Triplett talked about what they are doing in Kentucky, since they're kind of the leaders in having this law moving forward. But a lot of, when the speaker spoke this morning about things that are mandates that come and create large amounts of change that you just have to get on board with. This is one of those. When the president signed the 2018 Farm Bill into law on December 20th of 2018, it did change the definition of marijuana and removed hemp from that definition. And so it also established a whole regulatory framework for growers to grow industrial hemp, and also allowed for states to regulate the growing in their own states, and gave a process for states to create a plan and have that submitted to the federal government for approval. So the states must have a procedure for testing THC levels, and also for some kind of process for if the levels that are tested for in that regulatory process are too high, what the outcome will be. Most all, including the federal, are that the crop must be destroyed. And so for most states and the federal government, that regulatory testing for the part of the farmers growing is happening on the regulatory side of things and is not being done by crime labs, who are generally legislatively mandated to do criminal testing. Let's see. Whoop. So when the definition, if you look at it, the term hemp means the plant Cannabis sativa L in any part of the plant, whether growing or not. Basically, the key is that it has to have a concentration of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, of not more than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. Now, the issue, those of us that are drug chemists or have looked at any kind of drug stuff along the way, is that Cannabis sativa L is the same plant as marijuana, and they're just sort of different strains of Cannabis sativa L where they've been cultivated to have different concentrations of the chemicals inside. And so this creates a huge testing issue for laboratories. One thing that some state legislatures have done, including my state, so I've included the language here, which is probably very small, but you'll have the slides and therefore be able to see it later if you're interested, is create an affirmative defense in the legislative process, which basically makes it so that hemp is only excluded from the definition of marijuana if it is in the possession of a person that is registered as a grower, processor, or dealer. And somehow or another in Virginia, all those retail stores that have products all over the place are not considered dealers. I have not quite figured that out, but the agriculture people have defined it and have published that in their mind, retail is not the same thing as a dealer. And so the thing in Virginia that helps us is that down at the bottom, that's the part that talks about the fact that it is the defendant who has the obligation to raise the defense that they have a registration. And so therefore, if you have Cannabis sativa plant in Virginia, if you do not have that registration certificate, it is marijuana. And so that is great, except for that our legislature was wanting to allow products, and so they also excluded from the definition of marijuana any hemp product. And so lots of folks have figured out that it's a great idea to take like a hemp bud and put it in a bag and stick a sticker on it that says hemp flower and sell that at the store. And then that would be considered a hemp product and therefore legal. So that is something that's our law went into effect. The governor signed it on March 21st, and so it's already in effect. And so just these cases are starting to get to where they're going to go through the legal process. And there's going to be, I think, a lot of these kind of little nuancy things, like does that really qualify to be a hemp product, are going to be litigated. And that's something that has really caused a lot of stress with our scientists trying to, drug chemists have always been, it's cocaine or it's not. And so you report that it's cocaine, and that is listed specifically in the law. It's very clear what the deal is. Whereas this, new definitions, there are a lot of gray areas. It's almost like the legislation is written with all these different definitions like a Venn diagram of things instead of where they're all delineated separately. And so the scientists are having to figure out how to report things in a way that some of the argument of what category the material fits in is something that the attorney has to prove other things other than just what the scientists are able to show. So we are, of course, worried that 80 million samples are going to come into our lab that we are not used to doing and that they're all going to require a quantitative analysis. And so we're looking at ways to try and provide officers with tools to be able to have a kind of guide as to what someone has thought was probably, or at least somebody was growing this with the intention that it would be hemp, or somebody was growing this with the intention that it was drug. And so we're looking at a color test which has been used in Switzerland for many years. Their law is slightly different. Their legal limit is 1% THC instead of the 0.3. But this color test doesn't work as a quantitative test. It works as a ratio test. So if in your plant material you have more CBD than THC, that is most likely somebody that was trying to grow hemp, and it turns pink. And if you have more THC than you do CBD, it's somebody that was trying to grow marijuana, because obviously if somebody wants marijuana, they want to actually have THC in there so it has the psychoactive effects. And so that would turn blue. And so hopefully if it turns blue, they might send it to us for potential criminal charge. If it turns pink, maybe they look to see if this is something within the regulatory process that needs to be handled that way instead of sending it to the lab. One of the other things, just to note, we are about to send out a notice to all of our customers that makes it very clear that the Duquesnoy-Levine test is not able to differentiate between hemp and marijuana. And so I think that's something that needs for all law enforcement to have message to them so that they're understanding what the limitations of that test are, because it's changed. You know, the test is labeled as being a marijuana test, and that test turns purple all day long. With the hemp samples, we have tested it. We have a regulatory lab across the street from us, and we've gone over there and tested samples that were positive for hemp. They had less than 0.3% THC, and it makes perfect sense because the Duquesnoy-Levine test doesn't work just on THC. It's a test for cannabinoids. One other thing that is of interest to your labs as they are developing methods, and that is whether or not to report out delta-9 THC concentration or a total THC concentration that would be a combination of the delta-9 THC and the delta-9 THC acid. The reason that it's kind of a question is that in the law, if you do a strict reading of the law wording, it just says with a concentration of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. But if you look in the Farm Bill at the methods where it's talking about the methods that the states have to put in place that would then get approved by the federal government, it talks about using a reliable method such as a one after decarboxylation of THC, which indicates that that would be where you've taken the THC acid and you have forced that to decarboxylate and be THC before you do the quantitation and therefore give a total THC value. That's something that you may want to consult with your Attorney General's office in your state to make sure that that is, if you're going to do the total THC, and you don't have that specifically defined in your state. I know Colorado has defined that specifically now, but if you don't, you probably want to consult with your AG. I also wanted to give an update about SWIG drug, the Scientific Working Group for Seized Drugs. Yes, it still exists. It's not just SWIG-DAM that is in existence. The DEA has continued to fund SWIG drug even as the OSAC has been doing its work, although the mission has changed slightly to instead of just being for developing standards, it is really focused its mission for providing supporting information and supporting standards for people doing the work of seized drug analysis. There is a new standard that is expected later this year. The SWIG drug meets in June, and hopefully we'll have that finalized, and it will be published. All of the changes did go out for public comment. A lot of the SWIG drug recommendations have already become and gone through a SDO process at ASTM. You can see there where the chapters of our recommendations are the specific ASTM documents, and then 2 of those have been adopted onto the OSAC registry. One for sampling of seized drugs and one for the methods. That's the document that most people know of with the table that has the category A, B, and C techniques. The main thing that I wanted to point out with SWIG drug is that the goal here is to provide resources to your scientists, and I know that a lot of scientists are aware of these that do the testing. The monographs that the special testing and other collaborators are creating that are made available are extremely helpful to labs when they're buying all these new drugs off, from companies. You want to have some way to confirm or verify the identity, and so these are providing up-to-date monographs with spectral data so that you can do that confirmation of your reference materials without having to have, a published book because it just wouldn't be able to keep up. One other thing that I wanted to point out is that our emerging drugs task group, and Bruce kind of indicated this with his circle of all the different organizations. We've been trying to work with other groups. There's been so many people in this opioid space trying to not recreate the wheel. And so we have worked some with the American Academy of Forensic Science, also has a working group. And SWIG drug is now hosting the landing page for opioid resources that is kind of put out by that American Academy Task Force group. It's just I don't have the link there, but it's www.swigdrug.org/opioids. And it has a lot of resources that are not normal to forensic science. It's kind of a mixture of public health and public safety type of information. And I know that I get asked about how, what we're seeing kind of is in a nexus with the public health information at some times, and so it's good to have resources that you can point your policymakers to. So future direction, we are about to have a meeting. I am your representative on SWIG drug from ASCLD, so if you have any concerns or so forth that you would like to take to SWIG drug, I would be happy to talk to you. And we definitely try and disseminate all of this information. The recommendations are available separate from the ASTM documents. That way that they're free and available to everyone. And lastly, I just wanted to show the core committee as it stands now. There are 3 members of ASCLD that are on that, so you can talk to any of those. Scott Olton is the chair from DEA, Sandra Sachs, who is sitting over here somewhere, and me. And the thing that's interesting about SWIG drug that has always been one of my favorite things about this organization is that they have always been an advocate for having folks from the international community and also educators that bring that research element in so that that can be considered as standards or documents are developed. And that is the information that I had to share, so thank you very much.